All right, let's just jump right into this explainer. Today, we're tackling one of the most fiercely debated figures in all of South Asian history, the sixth Mughal emperor, Aurangzeb. Ruling from 1658 to 1707, this guy oversaw the Mughal Empire at its absolute peak territorial extent. We're talking almost the entire Indian subcontinent. But his reign is so intensely debated today, making him a truly enigmatic, almost puzzling figure to understand. So, we're going to look right past the modern political rhetoric and ask a question grounded strictly in historical data. Was he a religious zealot who destroyed a pluralistic society, or was he just a wildly pragmatic ruler trying to hold together an impossibly complex empire? To figure this out, we are going to focus specifically on the controversies and the achievements of his religious policies. Here is our game plan for today. We'll cover the emperor's polarized legacy, imposing Islamic law, taxes and Hindu bureaucrats, the temple paradox, executions and rebellions, and finally, assessing the historical record. Starting off with Section 1, the emperor's polarized legacy. When you look at his modern legacy, it is literally split right down the middle. On one side, you have many critics and historians arguing that his ruthlessness and religious orthodoxy completely ruined a pluralistic empire, basically remembering him as a vile oppressor. But on the exact opposite side, some Islamic scholars praise him for strictly adhering to the faith. They attribute titles to him like Caliph of the Merciful, viewing him as this pious ideal who abolished un-Islamic practices. So how in the world do we reconcile these two completely different extremes? Let's look at Section 2, imposing Islamic law. So early on in his reign, Aurangzeb had a massive public relations problem. He literally seized power by imprisoning his own father and executing his brothers. Not exactly a smooth transition, right? Because of this, he desperately needed to present himself as a legitimate defender of the Sharia. To do that, he sponsored the Fatwa-i-Alamgiri. This was a massive, incredibly detailed legal framework put together by hundreds of jurists, meant to regulate the entire empire based strictly on Islamic jurisprudence. And this massive legal shift led to some really sweeping decrees. He banned the practice of sati, or widow burning. He also prohibited un-Islamic activities like gambling and alcohol, banned the Zoroastrian festival of Nowruz, and even ordered the destruction of schools that taught what he deemed false books. But here is where the popular myth kind of outpaces the actual history. While it's widely believed today that he banned all music, historians like Catherine Brown point out that he actually never imposed a universal ban on musical practice across the empire. Moving on to Section 3, taxes and Hindu bureaucrats. Okay, so on one hand, in 1679, he made the highly controversial move to reimpose the jizya. This was a military tax on non-Muslims that had been abolished for 100 years. Obviously, this was heavily criticized, but the reality of how it was implemented was highly structured. The tax was actually scaled by socioeconomic status. It was waived during times of calamity, and it completely exempted vulnerable populations and state officials. Plus, it's worth noting that earlier in his reign, he had actually canceled over 80 other long-standing taxes that affected everybody. Now, get a load of this number, 31.6%. This stat completely shatters the popular narrative. Between 1679 and 1707, the percentage of Hindu officials in his administration actually rose to 31.6%. That was a record high for the entire Mughal Empire. Now, to be fair, he did actively encourage these high-ranking officials to convert to Islam. But the undeniable fact remains, he employed more Hindus than any previous emperor. Why? Well, it was heavily fueled by his desperate need to recruit Maratha bureaucrats for his endless military campaigns down in the Deccan. It really just proves that his political pragmatism and the sheer administrative needs of managing a massive empire often completely superseded his religious desire to shrink the non-Muslim nobility. That brings us to Section 4, the temple paradox. We really have to juxtapose these facts to understand his complex religious policies. On one hand, it is an absolute historical fact that he ordered the destruction of prominent temples, like the Keshavadeva temple, especially when they were associated with political enemies or local rebellions. But at the exact same time, he simultaneously permitted the repair of old temples and generously granted land and funding to Hindu and Jain temples, like the famous Mahakaleshwar and Shatrunjaya temples. He often did this simply to win local sympathy and maintain order. So, what is the crucial takeaway here? Leading historian Richard Eaton notes that the evidence we have is almost always fragmentary, incomplete, or totally contradictory. While temple destructions absolutely did occur, the confirmed count by historians is just over a dozen. The historical record is just much blurrier than the popular myth of this widespread, empire-ending demolition crusade. It was calculated political maneuvering that was either disguised or justified by religious doctrine. Section 5. Executions and Rebellions. Of course, Aurangzeb's rigid policies, combined with his relentless, non-stop expansionist wars, triggered massive uprisings across the entire subcontinent. We are talking about the Jats, the Marathas, the Sikhs, the Pashtuns. These rebellions required brutal military crackdowns. At one point, the absolutely vital trade route between Attock and Kabul was completely closed off by Pashtun rebels, which nearly collapsed Mughal authority in that region entirely. And his crackdowns? They were incredibly severe, and they did not discriminate based on faith. He didn't just target non-Muslims. Yes, he executed the 9th Sikh guru, Tegh Bahadur, who heroically objected to forced conversions. But he also beheaded Sarmad Kashani, a famous Sufi mystic, for Islamic heresy. He even executed his own brother. Basically, anyone, and I mean anyone, who threatened his strict political religious order was eliminated. Finally, Section 6. Assessing the historical record. There's the story from late in his reign that I think is absolutely fascinating. A Sunni official came up to Aurangzeb and petitioned him to purge Shia Muslims from the imperial court, purely on religious grounds. Aurangzeb's response to this perfectly captures his ultimate mindset as a ruler. He completely rejected the petition. He basically said, what connection have earthly affairs with religion? And what right have administrative works to meddle with bigotry? For you is your religion, and for me is mine. Wise men disapprove of the removal from office of able officers. Using his own words, we see a ruler who, despite his intense personal piety, his codification of Sharia, and his orthodox crackdowns, fully realized that an empire cannot survive on bigotry alone. It fundamentally requires able officers, regardless of their faith. So, I'm going to leave you with this question to take away from our explainer today. Was he primarily a religious zealot or a ruthless pragmatist using religion as a tool to hold together an impossibly massive empire? When we strip away the politics and look purely at the historical data, history is rarely just black and white, is it? It's a really complex shade of gray that demands we constantly keep questioning what we think we know. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.